Alright, so this is going to be about the Industrial Revolution and how the nation was ultimately transformed by the industrial output of the United States and many of the different things and many of the different inventions that ultimately will propel the United States into the world stage. So the railroad was perhaps the single most driving factor of the early growth during the Industrial Revolution, and really throughout the whole thing. You have eastern factories in New York and other eastern major cities that really were supplying the western boom towns and western farming areas with tools and supplies that they needed to be able to ultimately have a way of life out there. They brought in, ultimately would bring in lumber, they would bring in other materials and tools that would help them live and make their living. The first transcontinental railroad, so the first railroad that would actually go across the country, was completed in 1869, and if you look on here, this is the first picture that was taken of the joining of the railroads together. And this was just the first, because about 25 years later, 4 more of these transcontinental lines would actually be completed to really help bring in these goods and resources to other areas of the country and not just straight across. So this map right here is a map of 1870 and then the expansion between 1870 and 1890. So this in green right here is the major rail lines in the United States at 1870. So you can see, they come out of the major cities in the east. You have Washington, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, heading over west to areas like Cleveland and Chicago, and also in the south, of course. But as between 1870 and 1890, you really have an almost complete doubling of railroad capacity in the United States after the Civil War is over. You have, the ability to now push these resources into areas of the country, not just the war effort. And you had, in 1860, 350 or so different railroad companies laying these down, so that this really was an enormous effort on these people's parts, and it was really trying to drive in profits for these companies that owned the railroads. And I have the number here, at least 30,000 miles of track was laid at this time period. That's a lot of miles. So one of the early problems that the railroads experienced was as a result of this thing called gauges. And a gauge, as defined here, is the distance between the 2 rails measured from inside of one rail to the inside of the other. And what this actually means is that the rails were different from place to place and from track to track. So if a train could fit on one, it might not necessarily be able to fit on another. And this would interrupt the flow of the trains a lot going across the country, and there was no real continuous route due to these gauges and them not being one standardized size. So really, in 1869, when this railroad was completed, it really kind of solved this standardization issue a bit, and then ultimately these tracks would be replaced, and you'd be able to get all the way really around the country on one particular gauge. But before then, it was really an issue. They'd have to actually get off the train, unload the train, and load it all up onto another train that was fit for the next area's width of the tracks. It was really quite a problem. So you also have this standardization of time happening around this time period as well. The railroads were on schedules, and as they traveled across the country, they needed to adhere to schedules. So one of the problems that was faced is that the locals and all these local towns really all had different times based off of their location with the sun. So noon is when the sun is the height of its in the sky and during the day. Basically, what happened is these people all would have these particular times, and you could move 20 miles or 30 miles from east to west, and there would be a different time. So it would be really confusing setting up these train schedules moving across the country. So what you did is you get the standardization of time, and you get the creation of time zones. So you have Eastern Time, Central Time, Mountain Time, and Pacific Time. So in New York, say if it is 10 a.m., over on the West Coast, you have Pacific Time, and that is about 3 hours behind, not about, it is 3 hours behind New York's time. So if it's 10 a.m. in New York, it's 7 a.m. in California and San Francisco or LA, and it's all standardized based off of in this particular time zone. Okay, so you have a number of men that really propel the United States onto this global stage in business and their business models and what they are ultimately looking to accomplish. So one of these men is a man named John D. Rockefeller, and he ultimately makes his fortune in the oil business and creates this company, Standard Oil, basically taking advantage of the volatility of the oil market and the kerosene before he comes into play here. So one thing that Rockefeller really prospered in and was really good at was limiting competition. And one way he did this was by organizing his business and model into something known as pools. And what would happen is basically the companies would agree not to compete with one another by keeping the same prices. So an example of this would be at a local gas station. If there are 3 gas stations, down the road from each other at a quarter mile or so from apart, if one of them would lower the price all the way down to something that was manageable and they would still make some sort of profit, you'd probably get more business at that station. But what would happen is you now have these companies no longer competing with one another and basically setting a price and not moving from that price, so that they would not have to directly compete and those prices could stay at a higher rate, ultimately to make more money. So you get this Standard Oil Trust, and ultimately it's a monopoly. So you have Standard Oil begin purchasing and producing all the products and services it would really need to create this oil, really from the beginning. So from drilling it out of the ground to moving it around, as well as ultimately refining it into this kerosene, this standard quality of kerosene that would ultimately be safe as well as useful for the rest of the country. And you get this monopoly kind of taking place as Standard Oil begins to consolidate all of these businesses into this trust, and they're all operating under this model. He's owning these businesses basically. So next you have Andrew Carnegie come into play, and he really started off as a personal secretary and a telegrapher to the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And as this boss gets promoted, Carnegie ultimately continues to move up the ladder with him. And one thing that Carnegie was really useful for and known for in the beginning is this military telegraph systems during the Civil War. So what happens is this superintendent of the railroad ultimately tasks Carnegie with the creation of a bridge that would span the width of the Mississippi River. So Carnegie has to go out and figure out how this is going to happen. So he kind of travels all around the world, and when he does, he comes across this process known as the Bessemer Process, which goes from making steel, which is a much stronger building material than iron. It goes from making this steel taking very long to make this steel, to creating a way that will process this steel and make the steel significantly faster. And it takes advantage of basically superheating this molten iron and blowing into it with oxygen, and ultimately that blowing in of oxygen burns these impurities out of this iron at a much faster rate, and you create this steel that is much stronger of a building material. And with this, you have steel begin to absolutely take off, and you get Carnegie at the head of this with this steel empire of his. So you also now have J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan grew up in the son of a very wealthy man, and that definitely helps him be able to afford to do the things that he ultimately will do with his life. He is an investment banker, and he owns this bank, and what he really does is he will make his fortune by investing in and buying in different companies and kind of consolidating them and making them better and making them more efficiently run, and ultimately be able to get these businesses to be profitable again where they had been failing in the past. And in the one industry that he really does this in the most is probably the railroads. So he buys up these railroads that had gone bankrupt, and he combines them and organizes them into a single entity. So for example, if there were 10 different railroads down south somewhere, and he were to come in and buy these railroads, he'd buy the stock and buy the controlling interest in these companies. He would then combine them into one single entity, run more efficiently and much more strongly, in the hopes of making them a bit more profitable. And at the peak here, he would actually control roughly 1/6 of all of the American railway systems. And this wasn't really just done in the rail industry. He would also bring this into other businesses as well, and he would get into the steel business as well when he purchases Carnegie Steel. And he creates this takeover of Carnegie Steel, and he spends about $500 million to do this, which is about $12.8 billion in today's money, which really is quite a lot of money, especially back then. And you get the creation of this United States Steel Corporation. So this idea of trust that we were talking about before will create another term known as monopoly. And a monopoly is when one particular company controls all or nearly all of the businesses in a particular industry. And when this happens, the companies are able to set whatever prices that they would like, and there's not much people can really do or say about it. So you do get some government intervention in 1890 with this creation of something known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this is pushed for by the public in an attempt to control these giant corporations. And they attempt to ban the formation of these trusts and ultimately monopolies. And you get people like Carnegie really trying to defend the trusts and the wealth. And he creates this essay known as Wealth and Its Uses. And in this essay, you have Carnegie making the point that the wealthy can do a lot with this money. And this quote here, it says, "It will be a great mistake for the community to shoot the millionaires, for they are the bees that make the most honey and contribute most to the hive even after they have gorged themselves." And this idea from Carnegie is that these millionaires, they ultimately pay the workforce. They do a lot of philanthropic work to be able to help the community, and Carnegie was one in particular that did this. They created universities and different things that are going to ultimately help the public over the long run. They're not just giving money back immediately because he feels that the people are just going to spend that money in not necessarily productive ways. And by creating schools and different things like this, that will ultimately help the public more greatly down the line. So the workplace in this time period is very, very tough. Prior to the Civil War, most of these factories were small to begin with. They were kind of family run, they were small, you didn't have too many workers. But as this industrialization really takes off, especially by 1880 or so, you have work evolving, into an all-day thing, very, very long hours, 12 to 16 hours. They're tending to this machinery. You have crowded conditions. It could be horrible conditions. Very extremely hot in these sweatshops, in these factories from the machinery. You're getting just not being paid very much, very low wages. And one of the reasons why this was allowed to happen, or not able to happen really, is that you had a very large labor pool from cheap, unskilled labor from this immigration force that is ultimately coming into the country. And the fact is that if they were to fire someone because they didn't like their working conditions, there would be someone there willing to kind of take their place right away, because people needed jobs and needed money. And I mean, even if you weren't being paid much, to these people, any little bit helped. And this kind of led to the ability of these factories and these company owners to kind of have these crowded and horrible conditions that you see at this time period, and it be okay. I mean, at least people put up with it. So you get child labor, and in the 1900 census, you have roughly 2 million children under the age of 15 working, and they're working in all different sorts of environments. They're working in these hazardous textile mills, in tobacco factories, breathing in all of this dust, in garment sweatshops, in coal mines, in very dangerous conditions. And a lot of the times, a child's hand and things like that is significantly smaller than an adult hand. And if you were to have a machine get jammed or stuck, these people would often have these children, reach their small hands in to be able to pull out the thing that was jamming it. And a lot of the times, their hand would be crushed in the machinery, and things just were not really good for these kids. But they were stuck because their parents and their families needed them to make a little bit extra income to really help them get by. If they didn't have the extra income, it's possible they wouldn't be able to afford a place to live, be able to afford food, and they needed the kids to work. So you'd have kids working from very young ages in a lot of cases in some of these very hazardous conditions, and it's just not a great thing. So this right here is just a picture of the kids. It looks like in a mining area. They come up from the mines, they're working in a mine, and they are just don't look happy. They're pretty sad here, and it stinks for. I mean, imagine being a kid today and having to work 12 to 16-hour days at the ages of like 7 onward. Would not be fun, and it's miserable for these kids. Their childhood is essentially lost. So there's hazards in the workplace. You have things like dust filling the air, damages the lungs in these textile mills. You have cave-ins and gas explosions in the mines. You have steel mills had vats of this molten iron spill out without warning, and if someone was in the way, it could kill them, burn them, and really lots of different things. And some of these hazardous conditions would lead to people dying. Others would lead to some being maimed, which is if basically rendering parts of the body useless. So this picture right here is just an example of a child, an older child, that had a problem in one of the factories, and you can obviously see that he is missing an arm. And we looked at a bunch more of these photographs in class, and they're actually attached to a link on a previous slide that you can go to and kind of see those pictures again if you'd like to. So all of these conditions lead to a organized labor. Organizing labor is basically workers finding a way to battle these horrible conditions. They work together to make bargains, to strike, a number of different things to get the attention of the people that are hiring them to ultimately change the conditions of the workplace. So, I say here that they organize. They might slow the work pace down to a crawl to limit production. Striking would be to stop working, period, shutting down production and ultimately the profits of these people that were paying them. And you get labor unions pop up, and an example of the first real big labor union anyway is known as the Knights of Labor, and it's for skilled workers, workers that have particular skills, metal workers, garment workers, the sewing and things like that, and they would often use rallies to win the public support of goals, and they'd be looking for a shorter workday, the ending or limiting of child labor, getting equal pay for men and women, trying to share the profits between owners and workers, and that's what they were aiming for. And one of these examples is a strike that forces the hand of the railroad company, the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company, to restore wages from these people that they had been cut, and it swells. This Knights of Labor swells to approximately 700,000 members in 1885. So you have a lot of people joining these unions. So moving westwards into Chicago, you have something that becomes known as Haymarket Square, and Haymarket Square takes place outside of this McCormick Harvester Company in Chicago. Workers, they ultimately go on strike, and what McCormick does is they hire a group known as strike breakers, which are really replacement workers for the strikers. And these strike breakers often cause problems. They might even be told to cause problems by going out into the protesters, starting fights, among a number of different things. And obviously the strikers were not happy with the replacement workers, and this led to some major problems, especially here in Haymarket Square. So you have these clashes with the workers and the strike breakers. They lead to the deaths of 4 workers by the police. And the next day, what happens is you have thousands of people arriving to kind of protest these killings, and they are led by this group known as the anarchists. So the next day, you have a bomb explode in the square, and it kills 7 police officers. And you get massive riots, that take place in the square as a result of these killings the day before, and these 7 police officers being killed, and it becomes this major investigation to find the men that did this. And they ultimately capture, I believe it's 7 men also that are kind of part of this anarchist attempt to cause this mayhem and violence here in this square, to kind of push their union agenda in certain cases. And as a result, you kind of get this sharp drop in union membership. But as we kind of advance here in time a little bit, you have another group crop up known as the American Federation of Labor. And this is really multiple different unions for skilled workers based off of their particular trade. And what happens is you get a federation, a joining of these different unions under this banner of the American Federation of Labor, and they kind of all come together. So this really becomes the most powerful labor union in the country. And their big thing is advocating for collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is the right of these unions to kind of negotiate with the management for the workers as a group. So you'd have, union heads go into and talk with the management, all looking for a particular different thing. So, if their workday was 16 hours and they really wanted to limit it to 12 or so, that would be their main talking point, and they would negotiate and talk with the management and basically try to figure out ways to make this happen. And, this union starts off about 150,000 members, and at the peak of it, you'll have about 1.5 million members in this Federation of Labor from multiple different areas and multiple different skills and trades. So you also get women, working in the factories at this time period. And by about 1890, you have 1 million or so women working in these factories. And the biggest industry that they really outnumber the men in particular is the garment industry, so creating of clothing. And you get an international ladies garment union, and one example of something that they were able to do was you had 20,000 women in 1909 basically walk off of their jobs and in strike, looking for better pay and shorter hours. So they really were taking a role here. And sadly, you have a tragedy happen in New York City that becomes known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. And this is a fire that takes place in New York in one of these buildings where these women are working, and a fire breaks out in one of the waste bins of this factory. And the women have been, are in this room, and they're chained in, and they're chained in because they're not allowed to leave. You're not really allowed to take breaks. You're really the foreman. Your manager is really pushing you to work hard. And when this fire breaks out, only so many people are able to get out, with the doors being chained. Only one real elevator able to operate. You have many women, sadly, really stuck in there, and they burn to death. It's really a horrible tragedy in our nation's history, and it just kind of pushes people to really try to advocate for worker conditions and better working conditions, and really try to not let anything like this ever happen again. So throughout the 1870s, and all the way to about 1890, you have a boom and bust cycle. Industry really had led to massive growth, and you have really it's too fast in certain cases, and the growth floods the market with different goods, really every good you could really imagine. And having a surplus of these goods really drops the prices, and as a result, you have a surplus of these goods. You don't need to make too many more. The prices are low anyway. What happens is you have these companies fire off workers, right? If they have all this extra supply and the prices are low anyway, they don't want to have to pay any more people than they have to. And as a result, you have these firing of workers, and you have these cycles of this happening, and ultimately the demand will come up for these goods a little more, the surplus will kind of disappear, and you'll need to make more of these goods, so you'll hire more workers back, and then you expand too fast again, and you have these cycles of these between about 1870 and 1900. And other examples, you have federal troops often used to end big strikes, and one in particular happens out in Pittsburgh with the Carnegie Steel, when the Carnegie Company actually hires a group known as the Pinkertons to come in and kind of shut down basically a strike at one of these steel operations in Pittsburgh. And so things like this would slow the progress for unions, but obviously the unions they've won, I guess, and you can say, because obviously today, there's much better working conditions, much less hours, people make fair, typically, wages, and living wages, and, the organized labor the organized labor movement really has helped us today, for sure. So, you also have immigration during this time period, and this really is summed up in a poem written by Emma Lazarus, whose poem is actually at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. And the standard, the famous line is, "Give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." And it's basically summing up and trying to say that America is willing to take anyone that the Europeans really are willing to give us. We're willing to take anyone. It's a free country here in the United States, and people are able to make something of themselves here. And between 1865 and 1915, you're going to have more than 25 million immigrants coming into the country. And on the East Coast, this takes place through an island off of New York City, known as Ellis Island. So let's take a step back here for a second, and you wonder, why did immigrants come in the first place? And you have two different factors that really play here. And the first one is known as a push factor. So it's a condition that's going to drive people from their homes. So an example of a push factor is population density. If land is too scarce, people can't get land for farms. They just can't really do anything on this land because there's so many people. They're probably going to want to leave and get away from all of those people. In this case, people would be leaving Europe to get away from this. And with the promise of free land in things like the Homestead Act that we have talked about, you get people going from Europe trying to take advantage of this possible free land in the United States. Other things, religious attacks. So in Russia, you have this thing known as the pogroms, which are organized attacks on Jewish villages. You have political unrest in Mexico, which also brings thousands of Mexicans. So these things are pushing people away from their homes in the first place, where they came from, and they're going to somewhere else. So the other one is known as a pull factor, and this is something that is a condition that's going to attract immigrants to a new area. So, for example, a pull factor are jobs. So industrial jobs that promise, people money, in this case, are attractive to people. So you have people kind of flooding into these cities with the promise of freedom and the promise of money and maybe becoming something, and all of these people wanting to be the next big entrepreneur and make millions of dollars like the people we had just talked about. And this kind of creates a pattern in people coming to the United States. And often you have families sending a young person in the family, particularly mostly males, to make the trip, and they would settle in, they'd get a job, and they would make money and send it home for more people to join. And obviously the more people that you can get over to the new world, the more money you're going to make and be able to send back to bring even more members of the family over. And that's the pattern that you kind of see. So the journey across the Atlantic, or Pacific really, was really often difficult for these immigrants, because often these immigrants really could only afford the cheapest passage available in this class known as steerage, which really is typically the bottom of the ship, these airless rooms, below deck, and they're often crowded. You'd have diseases spreading. People are crammed in just all these quarters, these small quarters, to fit as many people as they can, because they're paying customers, and these companies, these companies really just want to get as many people as they can into the boat to make as much money as possible, and they don't really care about the conditions for the people going across. And people getting sick, people actually dying on the trip over, and they're just not good places to be typically. But people were desperate to get out of their old life and get to this new world where the sky is the limit, at least is what they're being told and what they're hoping. So Ellis Island opens its doors in 1892 as a receiving station for these immigrants. And when the immigrants would arrive, they would actually have to go through a battery of examinations before being let through. And they would be checked for things like diseases. They'd be looked at for mental instability and illnesses. You'd have physical deformities that then people wouldn't let through, because the idea is that they really want to make sure that each and every one of the people going through are fit enough to kind of look out for themselves. And if they're not, then they don't want to let them through. And diseases they don't want obviously to spread. So if you were to be found with one of these things, you would often not be allowed to leave Ellis Island until you were deemed better. And in a lot of cases, if you weren't deemed better, you would actually have to be forced to return. So imagine going through all the stuff we just talked about, for a couple of weeks on these ships in these horrible conditions, ultimately to get to Ellis Island and then be turned around and forced to go back without any refund on your money or anything like that. So this is just a picture of some people going through this sort of battery of examinations, as you were talking about. This is more of a physical examination. They're probably looking for checking their vision and looking for lice and things like that, checking to see if they're sick and whatnot. So this chart right here shows really a breakdown of all of the foreign-born populations in the United States from 1910 to 2010, and where these people are actually coming from. So if you look at 1910, you can see that 87.2% of all people that were born not in the United States that are now living in the United States came from Europe at some point. They had come from Europe, and depends on which actual era, but depends where in Europe you came from. But mostly Western Europeans early, and then you would get some more Eastern Europeans as time would progress. So 1960, you can see that most people are still European, but you're kind of getting the popping up of some other different groups. You have a bit more Asian groups coming in. You also have the emergence of more of a Hispanic population, and then by 2010, you can see a major reversal here. The foreign-born populations, Europe is only down to 12.3%, and Mexican and Asian populations have really taken off here. And Mexico is up about 30%, and Asian population is about 30% as well. So coming in from the West Coast, you have a similar thing to Ellis Island, known as Angel Island, which is in the San Francisco Bay. And being that this is the West Coast, and that coming across the Pacific Ocean, you would be getting mostly Asian immigrants. And often these Asian immigrants would face long delays to get in the country. There's this quote here that they felt imprisoned in the wooden building day after day, and that their freedom was withheld. And how could they bear to even talk about it? That it was just so bad for them. And these Asian population, really, culturally, major differences between China, especially, and the United States. They faced a major adjustment when they got